Hi, I'm Liz O'Brien, the CEO of the Queensland Trust for Nature, or QTFN. Welcome to our webinar about why we applied the Taskforce for Nature-related Financial Disclosures framework to one of our properties, Aroona Station, and how we applied the TNFD recommendations, and we did this with the support of BDO and Dr. John Rochecouste. We want to start by acknowledging the Yagara people as the traditional custodians of Aroona, where the TNFD report was focused on. We pay our respect to elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. The purpose of this webinar is to share our learnings from the process in the hopes that it's going to help you in the process if you undertake a TNFD analysis. So we'll talk about why we did the TNFD-related nature report, an overview and context of the TNFD, how we developed the report, key findings for Aroona, key outcomes, next steps that we're going to take after this report is done, and key takeaways that we have for other organisations that are looking to take the same journey. I want to introduce two of our writers of the report. This is intended to be an open discussion, so I'm joined by Brett Spicer from BDO and Dr. John Rochecouste, who is volunteering his expertise to QTFN. Now, we know how to do the nature-related part of landscape management, but how do we communicate the nature-related risks and opportunities for the business part of our operations on Aroona Station? Before bringing in Brett and John, I'm going to give you a little overview about QTFN and the work that we do. So our purpose is to protect and enhance the natural environment in Queensland, and we do this through a number of mechanisms. One is through a revolving property fund, but we also restore and enhance habitat on our own properties, but also properties owned by other private landholders. We also own a property called Aroona Station that was a living legacy gift from Dr. Robin and Kathleen Stock. It is being run for not only its conservation values, but as an agribusiness. And we are running a nature-related financial disclosure process to be able to understand the nature-related risks to the agribusiness part of our property. So I'd like to introduce John. John, can we take a step back and look at what TNFD is and why it matters to the agricultural world?
Thanks, Liz. I guess probably where we want to start is that the TNFDs are really about disclosures. So it's nature-related disclosures, and it's designed to, I guess, probably provide information to inform investors, to capital providers, and also the supply chain that are buying the products that you're producing. So it's using a market-led, science-based, I guess, area where government supports it, and we are looking at development across the world. So we've got sort of 700, all these organizations, 56 countries, trillions of dollars of investments, basically wanting to know how do we actually get a good disclosure so we know what the risks are. So this is particularly important for agriculture because agriculture is very land-based, and as is a number of other organizations which are there, and they're dependent on nature. So this dependency is where sometimes the risk will lie. And TNFD is designed to inform investors about what those risks are, which they might not know, but the farmers and the producers will definitely know.
Thanks, John. Now let's have a look at how this was put into practice at Aroona. Brett, can you walk us through those first few meetings?
Sure. Thanks, Liz. Look, for BDO, this was a really exciting opportunity to build on the work that we've been doing with clients around what was the Taskforce on Climate-related Financial Disclosures that has become an Australian accounting standard where businesses are required to disclose the financial risks and opportunities associated with climate change. So looking forward, I think this is naturally the next area that the accounting standards may focus on. Quite apart from that, there's information in here that is of genuine value to businesses to help inform management decisions and also to support conversations with their investors and other partners. We did find it was quite an interesting process. There's an awful lot of information available through the TNFD website, and we did run down a few rabbit warrens along the way. But we did find that things like the sector guidance were incredibly helpful, and we used those along the way. It was also really important for us to set the foundational data from the very start, because it was critical to some of the subsequent analysis and the planning and management decisions that were made following that. So some of the structure that was available to us was the LEAP framework, it's referred to. So it sort of sets up this framework where you locate the enterprise or the activities that you're talking about, an evaluation of the dependencies and impacts of those activities, an assessment of the material risks and opportunities, and then the preparation of the report and how you respond to those risks and opportunities. So we took the leap. The process that we went through. So on the slide here, you'll see the Aroona property. It's across two separate parcels, a north and a south. And as Liz said earlier, it's sort of situated within the main range area. First step for us was to locate the business activities that we were focusing on. And so we deliberately set a boundary around the fence line of the Aroona property and focused on activities within the fence line and also those ecological systems within the fence line. That was a deliberate decision in this instance to get us started and to build confidence in the process and how we work through it. So that also required us to document those interfaces with nature, including understanding what ecosystems were there, what biomes, what significant regional systems were present across the property. We then evaluated the baseline information around the direct operational activities. So focusing on the cattle grazing, the fodder production and the nature conservation activities. What were those activities? How much fertiliser was being used, for instance? What were stocking rates? So clearly trying to understand what those interfaces with the identified natural systems were. And then we went through a process of assessing the risks and opportunities associated with those direct operational activities. So where were risks being created for Aroona Station and QTFN associated with the activities in that interface with nature, but equally identifying where there are opportunities being created and what might be required, what controls might be required in place to be able to seize those opportunities. And finally, the preparation of the nature report, which you'll be able to find on the QTFN website. So what did we find? There was a lot of really interesting insights, particularly for me as a non-ecologist and getting to work with the really smart folk from QTFN, both the ecologists and the farm managers. But interestingly, I think one of the main things that it had us think about was the ecosystem services that were provided by some of those natural systems and services that we often just take for granted. And it made us think quite deeply about those. So for instance, provisioning services is one form of ecosystem service. Things like biomass, things like water supply that are provided and are critical inputs into the cattle and fodder production. Regulating services. So this is where nature regulates some of the environment around us, things like soil quality, things like water flow, overland flow across the property. And so again, critical as inputs and sustaining those regulating services are critical as inputs into the operations. Equally, we looked at quite clinically where were the impacts of operations on some of those natural systems, and so what sort of land use change or pollution was the agricultural production bringing into the system. What we did find was there was this really strong interdependencies between soil, water and vegetation. And so it wasn't to look at one of those things in isolation, but what was the interaction between the three and how did that interdependency either improve production yields or potentially reduce production yields if we got the management response wrong. One of the other things we observed was clearly a non-linear relationship between nature and business, between the dependencies and impacts and risks and opportunities. And as many of you on this webinar will understand, nature is a very complex system, and it's not just a 1 + 1 = 2. So we did find that when we'd identified a number of risks and opportunities and proposed some management responses or controls, it was to then go back and almost iterate and so understand how did that affect the dependencies and the impacts that we identified. Some of the findings, so we did go through and we were blessed to have the folk from the ecologists and the farm managers from QTFN to workshop and really think through where the risks were. So we identified a whole range, and you'll find the detail in the report. But if I just highlight one, for instance, it was around the deterioration of soil condition and quality due to poor land management practices. So if we observed that risk manifesting and impacting on the terrestrial ecosystems and the soil quality regulation and retention that we'd identified as an ecosystem service, that could potentially impact production yields from either the fodder or cattle grazing. So this was the process that we worked through. Again, as I say, there's a more detailed list of risks in the report. Similarly, with the opportunities, there was an exercise that we went through with QTFN ecologists and farm management team. One of the opportunities that I'd highlight is the fourth one down there, increasing the extent and resilience of ecosystem service, enhancing agricultural outcomes. So again, if we get that right and understand the ecosystem services and are able to enhance them intuitively, and I think scientifically, we're able to prove that they will improve soil quality, improve water quality, improve the biomass that's available on site, which will hopefully reduce input costs around fertilisers and so forth, but also improve the production yield per head by improving the carrying capacity of the property.
So what does this mean for QTFN and particularly for Aroona Station? So at the moment, Aroona is demonstrating fairly tangible resilience in terms of its ability to balance both ecological and commercial production systems. But there are some areas where there are potential risks coming into the future. And certainly one of the things we want to look at is the soil, which is really important for the production system, and how that's being managed, which at the moment there is limited data. Well, I think Brett talked a bit about this, how we need some of these areas of gaps of data that we're going to look at. And the other one is adapting the water infrastructure to help safeguard, I guess, the livestock production system under drought and during conditions where if we want to increase production. So these areas really need a little bit more work in terms of what this means. And also, one of the benefits of it is that we need to think about how this connects with habitat use and ecological resilience. So we've been able to, for example, Aroona's been able to use the cattle production system to help manage some of the weed areas or some of the grass and biomass areas as a fire management process. So these are pretty important as well. So from that perspective, I think there's a good balance at the moment. Obviously, the challenge will be what happens when we want to increase the production side. How do we maintain that, or how can we improve and get better data set for management in the future? So what's next as a result? So I think one of the things that's going to be important is how we actually strengthen the data set. So when we undertook this process, what was clear was that the data was not centrally located. It was often in different areas and there were gaps in the knowledge of data. So we had to go back and pull all this data into a foundational set. So we need to build on that data set to actually be able to report on this. So it needed to have a design and to fit a mature, fit for purpose area in terms of reporting to, asset management or to the supply chain. So if they're asking questions, do we have the information that required? So part of that was to develop a different transition plan that will give us the data set that would allow management to say, well, we have an increased fire risk, or we have a water problem over here that we need to actually look into and develop plans around that area. So it helped provide that scoping. And I think what we'll see in the future is data that better informs management and better informs the transparency that's required, and also inform suppliers so we can actually answer their question as to how we've done this and how we've achieved this balance between sort of nature areas and the nature offset areas and also the production system. And this is going to come more into focus as we sort of move through the different production system and given climate changes.
Thanks so much, Brett and John. That's been a really great overview of the port. There's a lot of information. Now we're coming to the end, but before we cover some of the questions we've been asked, I thought we could wrap up with some of the key considerations for other organisations. So to start with, we recommend you just leap in and give it a try. One of the things that we've appreciated through this project is that the knowledge of the risks is often there, but it's in a range of people's heads. So getting it down on paper makes a real difference for the organisation. Capturing the analysis and insights in a way that informs management decisions are really important. So this information doesn't just sit with the management of QTFN, we also provide it to our Audit and Risk Committee, our Investment and Property Committee, and our Governing Board of Directors. What's also really important is to communicate in a way that third parties can understand, such as investors. And also we recommend consider who you partner with to understand the nature and finance piece. So we know the nature piece. It's been really valuable to have BDO support us with the finance piece. And of course, having John help us with the agricultural component has been invaluable. The next section we're going to talk about is a question and answer session. So these are the frequently asked questions that we often get when we talk to people. And John, one of the first questions that we've got that I'd like to start with about how do we as QTFN can go about determining and managing the balance between conservation outcomes and agricultural productivity, and how these two focus areas are going to be quantified and reported in future disclosures.
So I guess probably the thing that we look at is there's three areas. One is we need to plan for these things, and there's got to be a governance process of which we're reporting on this. But I think the one that I'd like to focus on is adaptive land management. And this is where, and what do we mean by that? It's really if QTFN are trying to balance beef and biodiversity, for example, we will have the usual land management practices of things like grazing intensity, stocking rates, paddock rotations, which most producers have to deal with based on feed forecasting and seasonal consideration. But there'll be other things as well, such as habitat management and also wildfire risk as well. So we need to look at those things. So the trade-off here is how do we balance all of those land management practices that we need to do that in order to be able to make sure that we've got this balance right.
Yeah, it's going to be challenging for us into the future. So Brett, I know you had a lot of fun with the team digging through all our data. We have quite a bit of environmental data. How can we go about strengthening that though? So over time, particularly for other parts of the data that we need around water use, soil health and the non-GHG emissions.
Yeah, look, it's true. There was an awful lot of data that was held within the organisation and within the brains of people within the organisation, and so trying to download all of that was a fun exercise. I think the reason why we focus, the report did acknowledge that data is one of those challenges and one of those areas that we're going to grow into. Why I focus on data and the integrity of it is because it is going to be critical to generating the insights that management uses to make operational decisions, but it's also going to be key to having that confidence for investors and other partners to make their decisions based on that information. So I think the big focus there would be things like understanding what the water use requirements are for the cattle and for the conservation areas, and being able to better meter some of that water use over time. I think soil profiles was probably another area that we'd like to enhance, and that's taking some samples across the property, both the fodder, the conservation and the cattle grazing areas. I think data management is probably one of those other areas that we want to focus on, and so while there is this range of data, it wasn't always collected specifically for the purpose of a TNFD report. So how do we cleanse that data, ensure the integrity of the data is there, the governance around the data is there, and perhaps even think about a central sort of repository where all that data can sit and be accessed.
Yeah, that's the dream that we'd like to have. Now, for this inaugural TNFD nature report, we kept it behind the fence.
Yep.
So what about expanding the scope in the future? So we want to move beyond our direct operations, and we want to include upstream and downstream value chain impacts. How do we go about doing that?
Yeah, it's a good question, and the TNFD invites us to look at across our entire value chain to really think about the life cycle of our business and where the impacts and dependencies are, and equally where those risks and opportunities are. So I think it will only enhance the decision making through those insights across the full value chain. What we want to do, I think, is to start to look upstream and downstream of the Aroona Station. So where is the cattle coming from? Who are the suppliers and what are their practices? Things like fertiliser. What are the practices made for some of these inputs into your operations? But equally, where do cattle go and what are the practices of those partners that you're working with downstream? I think another part of the next phase of analysis would be thinking about the ecosystems or those bioregions beyond the fence line as well. And so understanding the impacts of your activities, say downstream and within catchments that you operate. So I think there's a couple of areas, expanding beyond the fence line. They'd be a couple of areas that I'd focus on initially.
That's good. Yeah. Looking forward to that. Now, John, here's a question that I know lots of people are very interested in. So how do we take these nature-related risks and translate them into financial risks, but then also the opportunity assessment piece?
Well, that's obviously going to go into a lot more detail, and this is speaks to what sort of Brett was referring to in data management, because obviously asset managers or anyone involved in investing in agriculture will want to know the data. But there will be some key points, some key risks, which most of them will be known by producers, such as water constraints, I think is well known by most producers. That's really important. Soil degradation is getting to be well known, and they may not know the productivity of the soil, but they will know the risk of erosion and so forth. There's also extreme weather event is where one of the new challenges that we're facing a lot more of in terms of heat. And also reputation. So that'll be the next one. So there's the risks. And obviously boards and committees will want to know about those and how to manage those. But there's also opportunities which will be identified through this process. And that is like, for example, can we get premiums? Is there a nature repair market that, can we use our natural capital asset for people to use as part of a revenue systems? Is there a brand value that's attached to having those on board? And does this give you more resilience? And so it's about understanding those sort of things from a financial point of view by investors saying, well, we think there's a value proposition in, for example, having a nature repair premium, those sorts of things. So we haven't actually got that directly done yet in terms of the details, but I think we're preparing for that.
Excellent. So I guess building on that, Brett, how do we take Aroona Station and demonstrate that ecological additionality and the credibility that we have?
Yeah, I guess one of the part of the exercise with the TNFD report was, or the nature report, was to demonstrate that coexistence of ag and of conservation practices, and that both can be enhanced. So to do that, we obviously need to set a baseline, understand what the baseline is and what those existing conditions are, but then understanding management's responses and how those responses enhance both production yields and or conservation outcomes. So it was really exciting, and working with the farm managers and the ecologists from QTFN to get an understanding. Things like 70% of the property is covered in remnant vegetation. There's a lot of programs at work at the moment to reforest areas and connect some of those remnant areas. There's offset management plans in place, there's weed management, fire management plans in place. So there was a lot of information that we were able to compile around that baseline. The exciting part is then understanding what the management responses are and how all those ecosystems and agricultural product and production activities respond to those for that additionality.
Yeah, good. I think one of the other questions that I'll take this one. One of the questions that we often get asked is about whether completing this report is a potential reputational risk for Queensland Trust for Nature, and clearly the answer is no, because we're talking to you today. But also we see that as a chance to lead and show that it can be done. Just leap into it and start trialling these new frameworks to be able to determine the risks, but also the opportunities that come that are underpinned by nature. And we can definitely have used this opportunity for learning. So what do we know? What don't we know? What do we have to improve, and where can we focus our efforts? So very much about, we don't see it as a risk doing this, probably see it more as a risk if we didn't do something like this. So that's that question answered. Another one we've got, John, I'm going to put this one to you. So how resilient is our business model, particularly considering the future climate change and water stress scenarios?
Well, look, at the moment, I think for Aroona, I think it's pretty good because you've got a reasonably low stocking density. So that means that you're not having as much pressure in terms of, say, water use or feed during the winter periods. And you're not as reliant on irrigation for your fodder production. So the issue will be what happens if you expand and increase how far can you expand the production system? Yeah. And this is always a balance that most producers have to face. What's the productivity of the land in relation to production? So there are some areas there, and what you've demonstrated is the ability to use nature as part of a natural asset to be able to work on that area. And a good example of that is having the plantings, using cattle to manage the fire risk by grazing those areas. And so it's at the moment it's pretty good from a resilience perspective. The question is how far can we expand it? And I think once we've got more data, we'll be able to do a scenario which we're not able to do just at the moment. Yeah.
Thanks very much for that. Thank you so much, John. Thank you so much, Brett. I think the other big underpinning value of this process has been the incredible collaboration we've been able to have with you and your team, Brett, but also your support, John, and the ecologists within QTFN, our farm management team. So thank you very much for joining us today.
Sure.
If you want some more information, you can see there's some contact details going to be presented on the next slide. And I welcome you to read the report and to leap in trying your own nature-related financial disclosure using the TNFD framework. Thank you.